The boy had no name, or if he did, no one used it anymore. Around the village, people simply referred to him as the orphan, as if his very identity had been taken from him the day his parents vanished. No one could quite remember how he'd ended up there. Some said his family drowned in a flood, others whispered about raiders, disease, or abandonment. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he lived alone, in a rotting shack at the edge of the woods, barely more than a pile of broken planks and rusted tin, nailed together with scraps. His days began before the sun rose and ended long after it fell, filled with hunger, cold, and silence. He didn't attend school, didn't go to church, and no one came to check on him. Yet somehow, he survived day after day, year after year. His clothes were threadbare, patched with mismatched fabric. His coat was too short for his arms, and the boots he wore had holes big enough to let snow in but not out. The soles had been stuffed with straw to keep his feet from freezing. His hands were always dirty, but his eyes those large, alert eyes carried something rare, a watchfulness, a flicker of spirit that refused to be crushed. He never begged. Instead, he worked odd jobs no one else wanted. Cleaning animal stalls, collecting firewood, digging ditches. In return, he got scraps of food or a dry place to sleep. If he was lucky, most days he wasn't, but still, he endured. Not because he had hope was too dangerous, but because he didn't know how to quit. That morning, he rose before first light, as he always did. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become a constant companion, like the chill in his bones or the ache in his knees. He slung the burlap sack he used for collecting driftwood over his shoulder and walked toward the river. Spring was near, but the wind still carried the bite of winter. The riverbank was slick with melting snow, the water high and angry from runoff in the mountains. The current had turned muddy and swift, and even birds kept their distance. He wasn't expecting to see anyone there. No one came to the river this early, except for fishermen in summer or travelers cutting across the valley. But as he emerged from the trees, he froze. There, standing at the edge of the river, was an old man. His back was bent, and he leaned heavily on a carved walking stick. His left leg dragged behind him as if it were half useless, and his long, gray hair blew wildly in the wind. The orphan watched him for a moment, confused. The man wasn't dressed like the villagers. His clothes were old, but richly woven, with small feathers tied into the hem of his cloak. He looked out of place, like he belonged to another time. The boy might have turned and left right then, if not for what happened next. The old man stepped into the river, just one step, but it was too much. His bad leg gave out beneath him, and he tumbled forward, the cold water swallowing him up to the chest. The river surged around him, tugging at his robes. The orphan didn't think. He dropped the sack of wood, stripped off his coat, and ran. His boots splashed into the freezing current, his hands outstretched. The water bit into his skin like knives, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the old man's arm just as the elder's head dipped below the surface. With a grunt, the boy heaved, struggling to keep his balance as the river pulled at them both. Step by step, they fought their way across, leaning into each other for strength. The elder couldn't speak, too weak to do more than breathe in gasps. The boy didn't say a word either. There was nothing to say. His muscles screamed, and his fingers went numb, but he held tight. Finally, they stumbled onto the far bank, falling into a patch of brittle grass. The boy coughed and shivered violently, then pulled out the last thing he had, a small crust of stale bread wrapped in cloth. He broke it in half and handed it to the old man. The elder stared at him, something unreadable in his eyes, before taking it slowly. No thanks, no name, just a quiet understanding. Then, without a sound, the old man stood and limped into the woods. The boy sat there alone, soaked to the bone, unsure if what had just happened was real or if he'd just saved a ghost. The wind picked up after the old man disappeared into the trees, leaving the boy sitting alone on the riverbank, soaked and trembling. His clothes clung to his skin, water dripping from his sleeves, his feet cold and numb. He stared at the forest for a long time, as if expecting the elder to reappear, maybe offer an explanation or a thank you. But the woods remained silent, the trees swaying gently, indifferent to what had just occurred. The river still rushed beside him, loud and wild, mocking his weakness. He could barely feel his fingers anymore. He hadn't expected gratitude. Something about the old man's quiet departure left a strange ache in his chest. Eventually, he stood, his boots squelched as he walked, every step a slow agony. He had to get dry before the cold stole too much of his strength. He returned to the crumbled shack that barely counted as shelter. It leaned sideways, patched with driftwood, missing a full wall on the south side, but it had a small fire pit and some kindling, and that would have to do. He stripped down, teeth chattering, and wrapped himself in a scratchy wool blanket he'd found months ago in a trash heap behind the bakery. He sat close to the fire, warming his hands, the image of the old man haunting him. He tried not to think about it, but the memory lingered, the way the man's body had gone limp in the water, how heavy he'd felt, like dragging a tree branch, through a flood, and those eyes sharp and ancient had looked into his with something more than surprise. It was like the elder had been studying him, even while drowning. It made no sense. Why would a man that frail attempt a crossing like that alone? Why hadn't he asked for help? Why had he simply walked away? The boy spent the rest of the day gathering firewood near his shelter, still too shaken to go far. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would care? Anyway, if he mentioned it to the butcher, he'd probably get laughed at. The blacksmith would grunt and walk away. Even the old woman who occasionally gave him soup would just pat his head and mutter about fever dreams. So he kept it to himself, just like he kept everything else. That night, lying beside the low fire under his worn blanket, he watched the shadows flicker against the wooden planks and tried to convince himself it hadn't mattered. He had helped because it was the right thing to do. He didn't need recognition. He never had, but something inside him whispered that this time was different. When dawn broke the next morning, the boy woke not to hunger or cold, but to the sound of hooves. It wasn't the thundering gallop of a rider in panic, nor the clatter of passing traders. No, these were slow, deliberate steps. He sat up, heart racing. His shack was still cast in shadow, the morning sun only beginning to bleed into the sky. He threw on his coat and crept to the doorway, peeking out cautiously. What he saw made his breath catch. At the edge of the clearing stood a line of riders, at least a dozen. They sat tall on painted horses, draped in leathers, feathers, and colors that did not belong to the village. Their faces were strong, their eyes unreadable. At the center of the group was the old man from the river, seated atop a pale stallion with a beaded halter. But he didn't look broken anymore. He sat upright, proud, with the air of a man who had once been a warrior or perhaps still was. The boy could hardly believe it. This couldn't be the same man, and yet, he knew it was. One of the riders, dismounted, a woman, taller than the rest, with hair braided down her back and a bundle wrapped in deerskin in her arms. She approached slowly, not threatening, but sure of herself. The boy didn't move. He couldn't. Everything in his life had been predictable, routine, hard, but now the world had turned strange, as if the single act of helping a stranger had torn a hole in the quiet fabric of his life. Then the elder raised his hand. "You helped me cross," he said, voice deep and firm, nothing like the rasp the boy had heard at the river. "Now we help you live." For a moment, the boy thought he was still dreaming. The cold morning air bit at his cheeks, but everything in front of him felt surreal. Warriors real, warriors lined the tree line like sentinels from another world. Their horses barely stirred. Beneath them, trained and still, as if sensing the importance of the moment, they wore hides stitched with beads, feathers that shimmered even in the pale light, and bone ornaments that clinked softly as they breathed. Each one carried themselves with quiet authority, and none of them looked impatient or angry. They just waited, watching him, as though this had all been expected. He stepped out of the shack, slowly, hesitantly. His breath fogged the air. His coat, stiff from yesterday's water, hung heavy on his thin frame. Every part of him wanted to retreat into the safety of his small fire, to pretend this wasn't happening. But something deeper, a pull he didn't understand, drew him forward. The woman holding the deerskin bundle stood firm as he approached, her eyes kind but unreadable. Her face was marked with age and strength, with deep lines carved by weather and time. Behind her, the old man sat tall in his saddle, no longer frail or broken. He met the boy's gaze, and again, that strange expression passed between them, not gratitude, not obligation, but something older, something sacred. But boy opened his mouth to speak, but the woman was already holding the bundle out to him. "From our hands to yours," she said, in a voice that sounded like river stones in wind. "No more cold, no more hunger." He took the bundle, almost in disbelief. It was heavy and soft. He unwrapped a corner and saw folded clothes, thick and warm, made with care. Beneath them, strips of dried meat and a pouch of dried berries. At the bottom, a carved wooden amulet, smooth from many hands, hung on a leather cord. It looked like the sun rising over a mountain, with tiny dots carved around the edge. The boy blinked, overwhelmed. He looked up at the woman, then at the old man, unable to find the words. "Why," he finally managed. "I didn't, I just helped." The old man smiled, just a small shift of his face, but it warmed the air like firewood catching flame. "Yes," he said, "you helped, without being asked. Without expecting. That is the way of our people. A gift given freely must be returned. It is the oldest law, but I'm not one of your people," the boy said, eyes lowering. The woman stepped closer. "You are now." He didn't understand, not fully, but in his chest, something loosened, like a knot he hadn't realized was strangling him. All his life, he had lived in the margins. The village gave him scraps, but never names. The adults passed by with lowered eyes. No one had ever claimed him. No one had ever said, "You are one of us." And now, here stood a dozen strangers offering more than just warmth or food. They were offering belonging. The elder dismounted. Slowly, his feet crunching softly in the grass. Despite his earlier frailty, he moved with practiced grace. The boy could see it now. This was a man who had once commanded others, perhaps a chief or healer. The elder stepped close and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. His fingers were calloused but steady. "You crossed the river yesterday," he said. "Today, you cross into something greater." The boy looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" The elder glanced toward the forest behind him, then back at the warriors. "Come, let us show you what it means to be seen, to be cared for, to be named." For the first time in his memory, the boy felt something rise in his throat, a mix of emotion, so strong it nearly unmade him. Not grief, not fear, it was something softer, something brighter. He nodded, and with that, the tribe turned, parting their horses to make room for him. The boy, still clutching the bundle to his chest, stepped into the path they made. As he did, the old man fell into step beside him, walking this time without a limp. They entered the forest together, side by side, as the warriors moved like shadows around them, silent but ever present. The boy didn't know where the path would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. The forest was unfamiliar to the boy, even though he'd lived near its edge for years. He had only ever wandered a few yards into the trees, searching for dry branches or edible roots. But now, following the quiet procession of riders and the elder at his side, the woods felt entirely different. The deeper they went, the more it changed. The trees grew taller, their trunks wrapped in moss, their limbs stretched skyward like arms in prayer. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy and golden spears, lighting the path ahead. He walked on soft pine-covered ground that muffled their footsteps, and he couldn't help but feel he was crossing into another world, one he had never been invited to until now. No one spoke as they moved. The warriors rode ahead and behind, watchful and calm. Birds called from high branches, and the distant rush of a stream could be heard beyond the bend. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds weight, like ceremony. The boy felt it in his bones. This was not an errand. This was a right. He clutched the bundle they had given him, still unsure what to say or do. He was used to being overlooked, invisible, but now he was being honored in a way he didn't yet understand. And the enormity of it pressed down on him like snow-laden sky. After some time, the path opened into a clearing nestled between hills. Smoke drifted lazily from the tops of tall lodges built of hides and poles, and children darted between them, laughing and barefoot. Women were tending to fires, scraping hides, or weaving colored threads into blankets stretched between stakes. Men were sharpening tools or leading horses to drink from a nearby spring. It was a small settlement, but unlike the village, he knew, there was no sharpness here. No cruel glances or whispered scorn. As the group entered, heads turned, but, instead of suspicion, he saw recognition. The people didn't gawk at him. They nodded in quiet approval. They looked at the elder, then at the boy, and their expressions seemed to say, "Ah, so it is him." The old man raised his staff and gave a single nod. Without a word, the group dispersed. The horses led away, the riders returning to their duties. The woman who had first spoken to the boy came forward again. "Come," she said gently, "you'll be bathed and dressed, then brought before the circle." "The circle?" the boy asked, voice trembling. "It is where names are spoken," she replied, "where those without place are given one." He followed her past the fires, past the soft laughter and the scent of meat roasting on spits, until they reached a quiet tent near the trees. Inside, steam rose from a wooden tub filled with warm water and herbs. A soft deerskin robe had been laid beside it. The woman motioned for him to enter, then stepped back, giving him privacy. He stood frozen for a moment. No one had ever done something like this for him. No one had ever offered warmth without payment. He bathed slowly, letting the heat seep into his bones, washing away days, perhaps years of cold, dirt, and sorrow. When he emerged, his skin was red, and his eyes stung with unwept tears. He dressed in the robe and stepped out. The woman was waiting, and without a word, she led him to the center of the village. There, gathered around a fire in a wide circle, sat the eldersmen and women with hair like snow and faces lined by time. The old man he had saved now stood before them, wearing a ceremonial cloak of white and red. He raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. "This boy," he said, "came from no one. He was named by no tongue and fed by no hand but his own. Yet when I was weak, and the river meant to take me, he crossed its fury and gave of himself without asking why. He knew not who I was. He asked for nothing in return. That is the mark of one who belongs." The boy stared at the fire, heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. Should he bow, speak, flee? The elder turned to him. "Come forward." With trembling steps, the boy approached. The elder reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were orphaned by men," he said, "but today, the earth reclaims you. From this moment forward, you are called Toma, which means the one who brings a cross. You are of us now, and you will never be alone again." And with those words, the boy's world cracked open, not in pain, but in light. The name settled on him like a warm blanket. Toma. The sound of it echoed through the circle, repeated gently by the others. "Toma," the elders said in unison, some nodding, others closing their eyes. as if feeling the spirit of the name settle into the earth. The boy no longer Toma stood frozen in the firelight, his breath shallow. For so long, he had been nothing but a shadow on the edge of a village, a nameless face in the dirt. Now his name carried meaning, chosen not from pity, but from purpose. He hadn't earned it with strength or skill, but with compassion he'd always carried in secret like a fragile ember. Now it burned openly. After the naming, the tribe celebrated. It wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet and full of intention. A clay bowl of sweet corn porridge was placed in his hands, still warm from the pot. A small girl with tangled hair offered him a carved wooden spoon. Others brought meat, fruit, and a cup of some herbal drink that tasted like mint and pine. They didn't bombard him with questions. They simply included him, offering a place by the fire, a share of the food, a part of their rhythm. Toma ate slowly, his eyes moving from face to face, still trying to believe this was real. There was laughter, quiet drumming, and the low sound of flutes weaving through the dusk. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the last golden streaks of sunset. As night deepened, the elder, the one he had rescued, sat beside him and handed him a folded bundle. "These are yours now," he said. Inside were clothes in the tribal style, soft leather trousers, a warm woven shirt, and a vest, stitched with symbols. Each thread seemed to tell a story. "The circle has decided," the elder continued. "You will stay with us through the season. If you choose, you may stay longer, or forever. But you are not bound. Belonging must never be a cage." Toma didn't speak. He couldn't yet trust his voice, but he nodded, and that was enough. In the days that followed, he learned how much the world could change in the blink of a morning. The tribe was small but tightly woven, and each person had a role. Toma was not treated as a guest, but as a brother in learning. They showed him how to repair fishnets with twine soaked in tree sap. He helped carry water from the stream, using yokes that didn't bite into the shoulders. One of the older boys taught him to ride a horse bareback, at first, just at a walk, then, with time and laughter, into a canter through the clearing. The woman who had first welcomed him, her name was Nima, taught him the meanings behind some of the tribe's hand gestures and symbols. "We speak in many ways," she told him. "The mouth lies, but the hands and eyes, they speak truth." One evening, as twilight painted the sky with soft violets and orange, Toma helped the younger children gather berries at the edge of the forest. One of them, a quiet boy, missing 2 fingers, clung to Toma's side as if they'd known each other for years. "You smell like cedar," the child whispered. "Like home." Toma smiled and ruffled his hair, not knowing what to say, but he carried those words with him like a second name. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. He'd wake at night, heart racing, unsure of where he was. The memory of the shack still clung to him, like a ghost with cold hands. But each morning, when he stepped into the sunlight and someone greeted him with a nod or a plate of food, the ghost grew fainter. The ache of being unwanted, the ache that had lived in his chest since he could remember, was still there, but softer now. Surrounded by kindness, it had begun to heal. One afternoon, while walking near the river with the elder, Toma asked the question that had burned in him since that first meeting. "Why did you cross the river that day alone, like that?" The old man chuckled. "Because I was testing the world," he said, "and the world sent me you." Toma looked at him, eyebrows furrowed. "Some say we are shaped by blood. I say we are shaped by the moments when no one is watching, when we help without thinking, when we choose to act, though we could turn away. You chose? That is what makes you one of us." Toma nodded slowly. He didn't understand everything, not yet, but he was beginning to. And for the first time, he realized he no longer needed to run, or hide, or wait for someone to come for him. He was already home. Seasons shifted quietly in the forest. The warm days of harvest began to shorten, and the wind carried a crispness that hinted at snow. Toma, once a ragged orphan huddled against wind and hunger, now moved through the village with steady steps. His body had filled out slightly with regular meals, his skin no longer gray and tight over his bones. The woven shirt he wore bore small decorations, now tiny bead patterns that Nima had sewn in, each marking a lesson learned or a kindness repaid. He didn't yet feel like a man, but he no longer felt invisible. Each morning, he rose before the sun and joined the older boys in feeding the horses, preparing hides, and carrying kindling. In the afternoon, he helped the women smoke fish, shape clay pots, or learn the meanings behind medicinal roots. His favorite task, however, was sitting with the elder, whom he now called Ashen, meaning he who returned from the dark. Ashen never ordered him about or tested him, but would instead speak in riddles and stories, always ending with a simple question: "What would you have done?" or "What does this teach you?" These conversations became the heart of Toma's new life. One day, snow began to whisper through the trees. Ashen handed Toma a long cedar branch, carefully sanded and polished. "A walking stick?" Toma asked, puzzled. Ashen nodded. "Carve it. Tell your story." Toma ran his hand along the grain. "I don't know how." "You will," Ashen said. "Stories live in your bones. Your hands remember even what your heart forgets." And so, for days, Toma worked beside the fire, shaping the wood with a bone knife. He didn't rush. Each mark had to mean something. At the top, he carved the raging river, the one he had crossed with Ashen on his back. Below that, a figure hunched and cold, wrapped in nothing but will. Further down, he etched a circle of horses, and a bundle of warmth extended from one hand to another. Each cut into the wood was more than memory, it was transformation. By the time he finished, snow had blanketed the village, and smoke curled from every lodge. That night, a council fire was lit again. Toma was invited, not as a boy, but as a speaker. He sat between Ashen and Nima, both of whom nodded to him gently. The drums were quiet now, the people waiting. Across the circle, elders sat with their arms folded, faces calm but curious. The tribe wanted to hear from Toman, at the Orphan, not the outsider, but the one who had acted without instruction, who had carved his own story. He rose slowly and held the staff in front of him. I didn't know where I came from, he said, voice shaking at first. I didn't know my name. I didn't know if I deserved one. He looked around, letting his eyes meet those of the listeners. I thought kindness was a risk, that if I gave something, it might be taken, that if I asked for help, I would be told I wasn't worth the trouble. But I helped Ashen that day not because I thought it would change anything, but because no one else would, and I couldn't walk away. He turned the staff so all could see the carvings. I didn't think anyone would see me, but you did. The fire cracked. The only sound was the wind outside, blowing against the lodge walls. I'm still learning. I don't know all your ways, but I've learned this. The river doesn't ask if you're strong, it asks if you're willing, and sometimes the answer is enough. The circle was silent for a moment longer. Then one by one, people stood. First an elder, then the children. One by one, they pressed a hand to their chest, then reached it forward, an old gesture that meant we share breath. It was how the tribe acknowledged someone who had spoken truth. Ashen stepped forward last. He touched the top of Thomas' staff, and said, from this day, you are not just the one who brings a cross, you are one who carries others. The snow thickened outside, the fire burned low, and for the first time in his life, Toma no longer carried the weight of being unloved. Winter in the forest was not something to be survived, it was something sacred, almost ceremonial. For Toma, it became a season of discovery. While the village slowed its outward activity, life within the lodges deepened. The walls were lined with furs, and long fires were built to last through the nights. Elders told stories not for entertainment but as inheritance, passing down wisdom carved into memory. Toma, once a boy who slept under broken roofs, now sat with others wrapped in warmth, listening to tales of spirits, of ancestors, of rivers that remembered the names of those who had crossed them. By now, the tribe had accepted Toma not as a visitor, but as kin. Still, there were moments he held his breath, waiting for this life to slip away like a dream. The feeling came late at night, when everyone else slept, and he stared at the flickering firelight and wondered, why me? What had he done to deserve this place, these people, this warmth that filled not only his belly but the hollow parts of his heart? One day, Ashen noticed this quiet weight in his eyes. The elder said nothing for a while, simply sat beside him, as they stripped bark from winter branches to make cord. Then, without looking up, he murmured, you still think you must repay us? Toma blinked. Shouldn't I? Ashen chuckled softly. That's not how belonging works. But you gave me a name, a place, food, a future. You gave us something, too, Ashen said. You reminded us of who we are. Toma didn't speak, unsure what that meant. Ashen continued, when you helped me at the river, you weren't just helping an old man. You were reviving something ancient, something too many have forgotten. That compassion is not weakness, that honor isn't found in blood, but in choice. Toma looked into the fire, the flames danced, and suddenly he remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. The face of a woman, his mother, perhaps smiling faintly, her hands worn and calloused, her eyes tired but warm. The image vanished quickly, but it left behind a whisper in his chest. She would be proud, as snow thickened in the coming weeks. The tribe began preparing for the long dark. Extra hides were hung, smoked meat was tied in bundles, and children helped gather dried herbs and berries. Toma helped carry firewood and repaired tools, his hands growing more confident with each passing day. Nima began teaching him songs, chants that spoke to the trees and rivers, and, though his voice cracked and his rhythm faltered, she never once corrected him with harshness. One morning, a scout returned with urgent news. A nearby settlement, one that had once turned Tuma away when he begged for food, had been struck by fever. Their stores had been burned accidentally, and snow had sealed their roads. The people there, many of whom had mocked the tribe for their strange ways, were now desperate. Ashen called a council. Some in the tribe were hesitant. They've never welcomed us, one man said. They spit on our ways. Why should we send help? But Ashen raised a hand, calm and firm. Because compassion is not barter, it is a torch. If we only light it for those who thank us, we become no better than the dark. The room fell into quiet agreement. A decision was made. Toma volunteered to go. He would join the small caravan of aid bringing food, herbs, and warm clothing to the village that had once turned its back on him. No one questioned his choice. Nima wrapped extra furs around his shoulders. A young boy placed a woven band around his wrist for luck, and before he mounted the sled, Ashen placed a hand on his arm and said, "Today, you become the river." Toma didn't fully understand, but he nodded. As they left, dogs pulling the sleds over fresh snow, Toma glanced back at the village, the place that had carved his name from silence, that had lifted him from nothingness, not with pity, but with honor. Ahead of him lay the people who once called him stray, but he went not to confront, nor to boast. He went to carry the fire that had been shared with him, because he knew now, the greatest gift was not receiving kindness, it was becoming the one who gives it. The journey took 2 days through deep snow, ice-covered ridges, and biting winds that stung the skin raw. But Toma did not falter. He had known cold far worse than this cold that came from being forgotten. Now, even as the air burned his lungs, and the world seemed white and silent, he moved forward with purpose, his breath clouding the air like smoke from a sacred fire. The sled behind him held bundles of dried meat, medicinal salves, and furs, gifts, not from pity, but from principle. Behind him rode 2 more from the tribe, silent but steady, their eyes watchful. When they reached the settlement, smoke drifted faintly from crooked chimneys, and the wooden gate groaned open without a challenge. The village that had once jeered when Toma begged and now barely had the strength to lift its head. Doors hung half open, faces peeked out hollow-eyed. There was no mockery here now, only fever, hunger, and shame. Toma stepped from his sled and unwrapped a thick bundle of blankets. He did not wait to be asked. He approached the first shivering elder slumped against a wall and draped a fur over his shoulders. The man stared up at him, confused, lips cracked. "Why would you?" he began. Toma didn't answer. He moved on, offering broth, laying down herbs, rubbing salve on cracked skin. He did as the tribe had taught him, without show, without expectation. That night, they lit a small fire in the center of the village, and some of the sick gathered nearby, drawn to the warmth. Toma sat among them, offering spoonfuls of stew and water, staying up through the night to tend to a coughing child, while her mother wept with exhaustion. When the mother finally fell asleep against a wall, Toma covered her with a bear hide and sat nearby, humming one of Nima's songs into the wind. By morning, word had spread. Men who once spit at him now extended hands, not in arrogance, but apology. An old woman clutched his wrist and whispered, "I remember you. I turned you away once. I didn't see. I didn't want to see." Toma only nodded. He wasn't here to answer old debts. He was here to close old wounds. After 2 days, the worst of the fever had been treated. Some strength returned to the villagers' eyes. The medicine had worked. The food had sustained them. Toma and the 2 others from the tribe packed what little remained of their supplies and prepared to return. As he stepped onto the sled, a group of children ran toward him. One of them held out a small wooden carving, rough, clumsy, but shaped like a horse. "We made this," the child said, to say thank you. Toma held the carving carefully. It wasn't perfect. Neither was the child's voice or the village's past. But it was enough. More than enough. When he returned to the tribe, snow still clinging to his boots, Ashen met him at the edge of the clearing. "Well?" the elder asked. Toma didn't boast or explain. He simply placed the wooden horse in Ashen's hand. The elder smiled and looked at him long and slow. "You understand now," he said. Toma nodded. "We carry others, even when they do not carry us." Ashen placed the horse on a stump beside him. "That is the mark of a river spirit," he said. "You do not flow only where you are welcomed. You flow where you are needed." That evening, Toma stood beside the village fire. Once again, but this time, he didn't feel like someone being honored. He felt like someone who belonged. The children surrounded him now, not out of curiosity, but familiarity. Nima offered him a fresh bead for his wristband, and Ashen pressed a feather into his palm, dark with streaks of silver. "For crossing," he said, "and for not turning back." And so, the orphan became more than a name. He became the memory of a tribe that had once stood at the edge of kindness and decided to step forward. He became the answer to silence. He became the boy who helped one elder across the river and helped an entire village find its way back to humanity.